Hello, I'm Katie and I'm making a video about Olympe de Gouges for a class assignment. I'm going to stick it on YouTube to see if anybody else can get any use out of it, so here it is. I haven't actually spoken to another human being yet this morning, so it's all a bit croaky up in here. Anyway, Olympe de Gouges, or OG as her official website calls her, which makes her the original gangster. I'm not sure how I feel about calling her the original gangster, although she was pretty badass. She spoke out about women's rights, the rights for children born outside wedlock, the rights of slaves, generally tyranny, wherever she saw tyranny, at a time when it wasn't really okay for women to be speaking about anything. She was also very politically active. She was a playwright, she owned her own theatre company, she published novels and political pamphlets, and she stood and spoke in the Legislative Assembly. This is like a woman standing in front of 500 men. However, she was not born Olympe de Gouges, or the OG, she was in fact born Marie Gouges on the 7th of May in 1748. Her family were petit bourgeoisie, I'm sorry about my French pronunciation, which means they had some money but not loads. She claimed she was the illegitimate child of Jean-Jacques Lefranc, although he rejected her claims, so we don't actually know if this is true. She married a guy called Louis Aubry at the age of 17. However, in her semi-autobiographical novel, she says that she didn't love him, he wasn't rich, he wasn't very well born, so all in all the marriage was not great. Thankfully, are we allowed to say thankfully about death? Thankfully, he died a year later. The marriage did produce a son. Her son was called Pierre, and Olympe and Pierre moved to Paris in 1766, and this is where she took on the name Olympe de Gouges, a little bit like a Twitter handle. Here she met a guy called Jacques Jacques Beatrix de Rosière, who she didn't marry, but she was his lover and companion. Throughout her career, she advocated for people having extramarital relations. You didn't have to be married with someone to have children and for the children to have rights. So her beliefs were very much reflected in her lifestyle. This introduced her into the wealthy society of pre-revolutionary Paris. The Enlightenment had formed this new scope for discussion where people could have opinions that would actually affect the government. It was this kind of forum for discussion that helped to shape both Olympe de Gouges and the whole of the French Revolution. She rented various apartments, one of which is over the side of Saint-Sulpice, which is near to Sciences Po if you want to go and have a look at it. It's got a little plaque on the wall where she attended fashionable salons, not salons like hair salons, salons like the salon in your house, your living room, where women would host intellectual discussions between men, women. It was one of the first places that women could participate in this Enlightenment discussion forum thing that had been invented. She attended classes at the lycée, she had connections with the Freemasons. Generally she was hanging out with cool, intelligent, playwriting, literary, upper class type of people. She even owned her own amateur theatre and wrote plays for it, so in 1784 her voice first entered this forum for discussion with her first play, which was called Zemmour et Mirza or Le Roi Naufrage. It was written with a slave as the protagonist, which made it controversial because obviously slaves didn't have a voice because they weren't people, and thus it was a break from the Western dominated narrative. I'll read you, this is the first thing Zemmour says, it's the second thing that's said in the whole play. Zemmour is the male protagonist, he's a slave and he's saying this to his girlfriend, partner. He says, "That barbarian, he loved you in order to tyrannize you. This love made him ferocious. The monster dared to give me orders to beat you cruelly. The education given to me by our governor added to the sensibility of my primitive manners. It made me even less able to bear the appalling despotism that gave me the orders to punish you." So Zemmour, the slave, is referring to his overseer as a barbarian, and obviously it was normally seen that slaves were the ones that were barbarians, not the overseers. The overseers were the people. Although he's got primitive manners, he is a person. He's got this potential for an enhanced sensibility given to him by education, which, if you've read it, is very similar to Rousseau's Emile, in which the kid is given an education and it enhances his sensibility. She also uses the word despotism, which is a political term. She's reading and thinking politically. The last time this play was performed, it was shouted down by slave traders and the play had to close. She wasn't afraid to mess with actual dangerous, contentious topics. She liked to be in the midst of the battle, actually getting herself involved in charged political debates. So, as the French Revolution hotted up, so did Ogé's writings. Her first political pamphlet was published with the meeting of the Assembly of Notables. The Assembly then demanded the Estates General, which was a meeting of the three estates, the third estate, the nobility, and the clergy, the third estate being the workers. This was called because France was basically completely bankrupt. The Ancien Regime's economic, political, pretty much social system, everything about it was just coming to a point of collapse. It couldn't sustain itself anymore. At this point, Ogé wrote Lettre au peuple ou projet d'une casse patriotique par une citoyenne, which sounds a lot better in France than it does in English. In English, it translates as the letter of the people or the project of a patriotic purse written by a citizen. In this, she suggested that the people pay a voluntary tax to the government, much like a child might help a father, might help a parent in times of crisis. She also called for patriotism, the defence of the king, and an end to the public disorder that was being caused by economic crisis. So the Estates General at this point moved to Versailles, and Ogé followed them because she liked to be in the midst of the action. And she published Pour sauver la patrie, il faut respecter les trois ordres. She believed that France should continue to respect the three orders, the third estate, the nobility, and the clergy, as they had existed under the Ancien Regime. She also suggested in this paper a combination of voting by head and voting by order. This was a contentious issue in the Estates General because the third estate, although they had loads of deputies in comparison to the nobility and the clergy, they all voted by order, so each order had the same proportion of say in the government, despite the fact that they had loads of deputies. So voting by head would mean a more equal representation, but this didn't happen, and the third estate felt they were being marginalised. Olympe de Gouges wrote, "The authority of most of the 1,200 deputies is linked to their constituents and depends on them voting by a head count. The rest vote by party. Let the king engage them to number all regulations in their power. Let each regulation specify on the ballot paper how it must be counted, and let these numbers be mixed up and placed in an urn." Had her suggestion been taken into account, maybe the rest of the French Revolution wouldn't have occurred. Who knows? So the Estates General fell apart. The Third Estate declared themselves the National Assembly and later the National Constituents Assembly on the 20th of June. On the 27th of June, the king decreed that the nobility and the clergy should all join the Third Estate. The nobility were no longer, according to Ogé, clinging on to their rights. France finally seemed to be united under one political order in which social equality and economic equality was something that might actually occur. On August 26th, the National Constituent Assembly adopted the Declaration of the Rights of the Man and the Citizen as their policy. The Declaration of the Rights of Man and Citizen addressed the right that men should have. They were born free, they should live free, they should live equal, they should have right to religious beliefs, right to freedom of speech. All the things that we claim as our rights today were mostly developed in this document. However, Olympe noticed a problem in that it was the rights of man and the citizen. Man and the citizen, as in they didn't mention women in this at all. So although they claim that men should have these rights simply because they were human, women didn't have these rights. Women, maybe weren't human, I don't know. So as a comeback, Ogé wrote the Declaration of the Rights of Women. This is perhaps her most famous piece of work. She wrote it in September 1791, so a few years later. Some of it reads literally as adding woe to the beginning of the word men, or adding women and, so that it's women and man rather than just man should have these rights. Point 2 of Ogé's Declaration of the Rights of Women is the purpose of all political association is the preservation of the natural and imprescriptible rights of woman and man, so she's added woman. These rights are liberty, property, security, and especially resistance to oppression. So she's added the word especially because she feels that women are especially oppressed. However, in other sections she develops her own ideas. For example, she advocates for the rights of unmarried mothers. She said that they should have no shame in having a child outside wedlock, and men should be obliged to claim these children as their own. She states that women should have the same property and inheritance rights as men. They should have the same freedom of speech. And she wrote this in the poignant phrase, "Women have the right to mount the scaffold, and therefore should have the right to mount the rostrum." So they have the right to be killed just as men do for their crimes, but they don't have the right even to commit the same crimes. They don't have the right to speak out about their beliefs, whether they be for or against the revolution, despite the fact they can be punished the same. Strangely, or one might think strangely, her writings sometimes sound disparaging towards women. For example, in her Lettre au Peuple, she writes, "The Estates General may well find other solutions, but whatever usage they may make of their own wisdom, they cannot find the advice of a woman out of place, one who, despite the natural lightheadedness of her sex, has nonetheless some sensible opinions." Why would she call herself lightheaded when she's so evidently not lightheaded? She's strong-minded, she's strong-willed, but she is a product of her time. The Enlightenment and the pre-revolution didn't just bring about feminism, they also brought about a kind of biological justification of women as the lesser sex. Because women looked and were physically different to men, they were mentally different, they were more incapable, they were literally made of softer stuff. Their brains were like jellies, they couldn't hold on to firm ideas. So although Olympe was writing and thinking about equality, she would also have been reading and discussing these kind of ideas of inequality that were being propagated. So she's just a product of her time. So next up, vaguely chronologically, the Terror began in Paris. The Terror was institutionalized violence. The government were so scared of anything being anti-revolutionary, now they'd caused this revolution, that terror became the order of the day. They were just killing anybody that they felt to be anti-revolutionary. So that was literally like, you said something about, he said he liked the king, so we should kill him because that's anti-revolutionary. And OG saw that it was vague, she saw tyranny, and so she spoke out against it. She wrote, I'm not even going to try and say this in French, "The pride of innocence or the silence of true patriotism." I've got a quote from it. "Alas, when the Constituent Assembly engaged men of letters to research the penal code in order to repeal the death penalty, even for the condemned, did they imagine that after 4 years of a revolution enlightened by philosophical ideals, the French would, without cease, kill their fellow citizens?" So she's saying, this isn't reasonable. She was against the death penalty, she was against irrational killing and tyranny, and thus she was against the terror. But in the confusion of who was for the revolution and who was anti-revolution, it was dangerous to say things like this. It was dangerous to talk against the policy of the government, no matter how unfair and how irrational it seemed to be. Although she claimed herself to be a Republican, she did offer to defend the king in his trial. He had been accused of treason and was going to be tried for treason. However, she felt that under the constitution at the time that he committed his crimes, because he was the king, he was exempt from the legal procedures. He was the king, at the time, and a punishment for treason was to remove his kingship. And since the monarchy had been abolished, he was no longer king, he'd been punished enough, he was no longer guilty. She believes that his only fault was to be unlucky enough to be the king when the cup cracked in his hands. So it wasn't him that caused the problems, him as a man, it was the previous Ancien Régime monarchy. She wrote that Louis Capet's greatest crime, it must be conceded, was to be born as a king at a time when philosophy was silently laying the foundations of the Republic. So he wasn't guilty. "We have abolished royalty, people, throne, he has lost everything. Let's be generous enough to leave him with his life." So she's calling to their sentiments. She's saying killing him would be wrong. However, this made her seem like a royalist, so an armed gang of men appears outside her flat, and she narrowly avoids her death by talking her way out of it when there's a guy standing with a knife to her throat, at which point, like I think most people would, she kind of went, whoa. She wrote "mon dernier mot," my last word, and tried to leave political life. So she buys a cottage in Touraine and attempts to set up home for her son, daughter-in-law, and by this time her grandchild as well. However, she can't keep herself away from political life. After the death of the king, she continues to advocate for democracy. So, on account of being a royalist and anti-revolutionary, she gets arrested. While she's in prison, she continues to publish. She writes Olympe de Gouges au tribunal révolutionnaire, which is the famously unfair revolutionary trials. She writes about her experience in prison, her innocence, and her blatant republicanism. She refers to her poster Les Trois Heures ou le salut de la patrie par une voyageur aérienne, The Three Urns, or The Salvation of the Fatherland by an Aerial Traveller, in which she suggests that there should be a national vote for how the government was going to be run. Because she said this, they thought she was counter-revolutionary, which clearly she wasn't. She was suggesting that there should be a democratic vote for how the government was going to be run, but this was not okay. It's just a reflection of the charged situation she was involving herself in. Not only was she a woman in politics, she was a woman in dangerous politics. She wasn't afraid to get herself involved in the battle. And these were the dangerous politics that took her life. On October 28th, she was moved to the conciergerie, which is on Ile de la Cité, and on the 5th of November, she was finally killed by the guillotine. You might remember that she said, if women have the right to be killed, they should also have the right to mount the rostrum. She exercised both of these rights. She spoke out publicly about what she believed in, and she exercised her right to be killed. But at least she died with something that she believed in. So Olympe de Gouges, OG, she was pretty cool. She advocated for the rights of women, whether the good things and the bad things, the rights of children outside of wedlock, the rights of slaves. She thought that the king shouldn't be killed because it was unfair. It's almost like the whole of the revolution would have been a little bit better if people had actually listened to what she was saying. I like to think that if OG was alive today, she would have voluntarily paid £10 to get into a club. You know when they say £10 for men but women can get in free? OG would have paid the £10 because if women are going to accept the privilege that their equality gives them, they should also affect the downsides. So yeah, she was pretty cool. I hope this has been helpful. I'm sorry it's really long. Peace out.